Good afternoon, everybody. Or, yeah, I guess it is afternoon. Thanks for coming to the seminar. I want to introduce our speaker today, Jim Shaw. Many of you know Jim because he's formerly a faculty member with us and currently is an adjunct faculty member. And I know he met with a lot of the students already this morning, and we'll be meeting with some of our faculty as well. Just a little bit of background. Jim got his PharmD at the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and his PhD at the University of Arizona. He worked at Thomas Jefferson University for a couple years, specializing in headache pharmacotherapy, and worked at the headache clinic there. And then he came to UIC, was on our faculty from 2006 to 2011. And some of our students were still here then. And he actually was Yash's master's advisor, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yash is still in our program.
He's still in the PhD program?
Yep.
You're kidding?
He hasn't quite finished yet.
He's ABD. He went to heaven. I thought he was done.
No, not quite yet. So he outlasted you by a mile.
Don't do as Yash did.
So Jim left in 2011 and went to work for Abbott, just up the road. Was lured by the big money, glamour, nightlife. Which of those was it?
It actually, I mean, nothing but the money lured me.
The money,
Unfortunately,
okay,
I had to suffer through the remainder of it, especially the nightlife and the glamour. Yeah.
So he's done very well in industry. He's gotten promoted several times. He's now director of, and I'm not going to get this quite right, but it's very impressive. Worldwide health economics and outcomes research, specializing in oncology for Bristol-Myers Squibb, and lives outside of Philadelphia. Has a huge mansion.
You got the yacht, don't you?
I have a toy boat, but not a yacht. So we're really happy to have Jim back. He's going to be talking about relative value assessment in oncology, which, of course, as we look at prices of new drugs, especially oncology drugs, there's a lot of discussion about this. So thanks, Jim.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. And to be clear, my current role within the organization focuses mainly on clinical outcomes assessment. So it's about PROs predominantly within and across our oncology indications. So what I'm going to present to you today on value assessment really borrows from a work stream that I inherited and have been spending the better part of 2 years schooling myself in. But it is, I think, key, and as some of you I've discussed with some of the students I've discussed this with earlier today, which strongly advocate thinking very carefully about this and the role that this is playing in helping to affect, I think, really really guide public policy in this country in terms of ultimately how we're going to price and develop the amount of resources we're going to develop in oncology. Disclaimer, nothing important there. So today, again, going to focus on a work stream I've been working in for the last 2 years on relative value assessment methodology. We'll go over issues pertinent to value assessment in oncology, sort of laying out the groundwork for why we developed this work stream and other work streams that have emerged. Describe the relative value assessment's implementation via a tool that was developed by BMS, illustrate how it can be used to address stakeholder questions, and contrast RVA with some of the assessment frameworks that have evolved. If there's any time remaining, some brief Q&A over value assessment and any questions one may have about biopharma. So cancer is an ever-growing public health concern. There's been an estimated, I think, 14.1 billion new cases and 8.2, million cases and 8.2 million new deaths per year worldwide. A number of new therapies have been developed in recent years, resulting in for some tumor types, rather impressive improvements in survival and quality of life, but those have come with some staggering costs relative to other therapeutic areas. Drivers of those costs include an aging population, increased survival, personalized medicine, as well as the adoption of novel and costly therapies as standards of care. With these increases in cost of care, there's a vital need to understand the value of oncology therapies, and moreover, to be able to define and, thank you so much, communicate that value appropriately in order to facilitate successful access decisions. So, for example, consider the case of Herceptin and Perjeta. Both are approved for HER2-positive, the treatment of HER2-positive breast cancer. Herceptin in combination with chemotherapy, Perjeta in combination with chemotherapy, and Herceptin in 2012. Total cost of treatment for Perjeta estimated at $188,000 US, an incremental cost of $115,000 over Herceptin. Whether or not that incremental spend is a worthwhile investment depends on the incremental gain, outcome gain achieved with Perjeta, and moreover, the credibility or importance attributed to that outcome by a given stakeholder. So why is RVA needed? In oncology, with the emergence of treatment classes like the immuno-oncology therapies, including currently approved products such as ipilimumab, nivolumab, and pembrolizumab, these drugs ain't cheap, and there's an increasing attention being paid to the cost of care, and for whatever reason, different stakeholders applying their own voices around whether or not those costs are valid. Existing metrics for evaluating cancer therapies may fall a bit short in defining the value provided by newer treatments. So there is a fair amount of evidence at this point, for instance, around median survival, median OS, effectively, and its inadequacy in illustrating the value of immuno-oncology therapies, those, for instance, I just named, relative to standards of care. Conversely, alternative metrics such as mean survival seem to be better suited, for at least more sensitive to identifying differences between treatments. So it's important. I think there's a growing concern in how we should, in fact, define value, measure value, and that one metric may not be, it may not simply be an issue of one hammer can do all tasks. We may need a toolkit, a suitable toolkit for defining value. Moreover, it's important to recognize stakeholders have diverse perspectives on what constitutes value. So I think many in the audience are probably thinking, well, a cost-effectiveness model should solve everyone's ills. I hope at the end of the presentation, attendees may have a bit of a broader perspective, not just in terms of where, say, for example, CEA sits relative to some of the other frameworks I'll discuss in terms of stakeholder communications, but in terms of what type of outcome metric is going to be, frankly, can be communicated to a given stakeholder. Again, median OS, median PFS are the gold standards, at least from a clinical perspective. But if you're talking about other stakeholders, may in fact, in some markets, may value number needed to treat. In some cases, we get requests for data on milestone or landmark survival. So it's important to keep in mind that different stakeholders may value different metrics. And for that reason, we may need a broad metric portfolio in order to fully address valuation needs. So what is relative value assessment? Given the aforementioned concerns, BMS initiated an RVA work stream a number of years ago in an attempt to better assess and communicate the value of its IO assets using a number of different or myriad outcome metrics, both within and across indications. The idea was to say, instead of simply focusing just on one outcome metric, particularly on trial data, is there a better way to look across metrics and build a perhaps more cohesive, broader picture understanding of the data, particularly not just within, maybe not just even within a given indication, but if we envision different tumor types, different even lines of therapies within tumor types as potential oncology spends, what is the value add, for instance, of, say, I don't know, metastatic melanoma second line versus a spend on, let's say, breast cancer, all comers first line. So these are some questions which RVA provides at least some semblance of an ability to address. As part of this work stream or initiative, Bristol-Myers developed a tool to facilitate RVA communications. The tool was Excel-based. In its initial form, was largely a data repository with some modicum of graphing capability. The initial tumors that were included were largely solid tumors, metastatic, with the addition of multiple myeloma. The focus on metastatic disease was perhaps obvious. 90% of cancer deaths are attributable to metastatic cancer, and frankly, that's where most of the development work is ongoing. In terms of comparators or treatments selected for inclusion, there were a number of requirements, mainly driven by the availability of phase 3 data, where OS was a primary or secondary endpoint, that OS data had to read out on approval for FDA or EMA, that we had to have Kaplan-Meier curves available to facilitate mean overall survival estimation. We had to have at least 1 year follow-up data, again, to facilitate the estimation of certain milestone survival metrics, and that they had to be launched within the last 10 years in the US and EU. Again, frankly, most of the relevant development work in oncology has occurred in the last 10 years. Looking beyond that time frame, and you're really looking into an era of treatment that was, perhaps one could label as barbaric. Outputs, as you can see, a wide range of efficacy metrics were initially considered for inclusion, means as well as medians of OS and PFS, 1 and 2 year milestone survival response rates, and number needed to treat to avoid death at 1 year. Also estimated cost data, both monthly and total. So when I inherited this work stream, interestingly, as some of you, I mentioned this to earlier today, I first wanted to get a feel for what we were actually using this tool for, and conducted a survey with representatives of all of our key markets and second-tier markets, to be frank. The information I got back was quite interesting at the time. Maybe about half of the markets indicated that they used it for different purposes, with the other half basically saying, no, we don't use it at all, largely due to its limitations, which should, if not obvious currently, will become obvious throughout the presentation. So, in some sense, you're saying, okay, well, we're doing all this work for a delimited set of stakeholders. Is there anything we can do to make this more value added? So in 2015, I set out seeking to overhaul the tool, making it more of a real evidence-based tool, including revamping the interface, making it more user-friendly, dramatically improving the graphing functionality. The idea is you should be able to, anything you generate in the tool, you should be able to output immediately into a PowerPoint without any sort of post hoc manipulation. And we largely achieved these objectives. Moreover, massive updates to the evidence base supporting the tool, particularly to accommodate the indications for Opdivo that were coming online at that point. including the life cycle indications such as head and neck, for those of you who may not have been following the news today. And as well, in building in functionality whereby users could actually subset the data based on histology, biomarker status, or even facilitate comparisons with pipeline products, which was not something previously attainable or manageable. Again, all of this was designed to make this a more useful tool to our stakeholders, which from a worldwide standpoint are my market colleagues. So in its current form, I think we largely succeeded in developing a tool that could be used for the following objectives. Again, highlighting the clinical value provided by novel therapies from a selfish perspective. From our perspective, obviously it's IO. Certainly that's where most of the development work seems to be going currently, even whether you're looking at the PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors or even vaccines, but it's really with immuno-oncology currently. Also helping to facilitate the selection of appropriate price-value benchmarks for therapies. This tool has been and will continue to be extremely value-added in helping to inform pricing decisions internally. And lastly, to facilitate external communications with stakeholders to show that currently reimbursed treatments are largely offering, significant costs. I don't know if significant is the right word, but offering costs without providing a reasonable level of survival gain or outcome gain, certainly not at the scale provided by IO therapies. So the tool, and I maybe seem to be going back and forth between the concept of RVA and the tool, but again, since the concept was developed by BMS and it's largely represented in the form of a tool, I think it's fair to do that. What RVA can and cannot be used for? Well, in its current form, in addition to allowing for direct comparisons of outcome metrics, albeit naive trial comparisons, it's also has been found to be somewhat useful for providing estimates of cost value relative to averages for a given market basket of comparators. And I'll show some slides in a bit that will perhaps make that concrete. What it cannot be used for in its current form, and actually for the students I've talked to today with an interest in this topic, which is something that I think you should really think about, whether it's a dissertation or other vein of research, is providing some sort of composite value measurement. So in its current form, outcomes are looked at individually. So I can sit there and say, how do we fare on mean OS? How do we fare on median OS? And you, over time, over a vast array of outcomes, you hope to get some sort of consistent story, but maybe not. And moreover, what may appear to be a suitable outcome or what may appear to be the right outcome to be gauging value in one tumor type may not be in another tumor type. So I think a key area for research, whether it's through BMS or through any other entity, is to really help look at what are the right outcome metrics to be looking at within and across tumor types, and maybe even thinking more broadly about are there ways to synergize the data to develop some form of composite endpoint that is well suited. And that there are agencies that have tried to sort of do that, some of these valuation frameworks that I'll talk about in a bit. I don't think that, I don't think they've necessarily got it full yet, but this is an area where students may want to spend some time thinking about. Additionally, in its current form, the tool is market specific. It's not designed for cross-country comparisons, prices, and typically agents. I mean, the focus is on approved agents within markets, and the prices are obviously all tailored for a given market. Some internal and external applications that we've used this for, and I think that this is sort of, again, for students who may not be familiar with the industry, getting some understanding in terms of how pricing decisions are made. this tool is used actually quite a bit in pricing discussions at a worldwide level. I don't want to name names, but I mean, in a recent product that is currently under study, another one of our assets, not Opdivo, I was drawn into discussions around how to best use this tool to look at that product, which unfortunately is approved for use with another approved product that's on the market that also tends to be very expensive, and effectively gauge given we're saddled with this highly expensive add-on drug, and here's what we see in terms of clinical outcomes. What turns out to be a reasonable price, or what might be a reasonable price given what we see in terms of outcomes. Additionally, training of sales force and field staff been very useful in terms of helping to ensure that our field staff understand and can communicate on, as I lose my voice, our outcomes data relative to the competition. Lastly, and another area where it's helpful, has been somewhat helpful in, but I think there's a lot of work to be done in this area in helping to identify the right endpoints to include in future trials. So I mentioned previously, I don't think it's fair to say that median OS is the right outcome metric for all tumor types in all circumstances. And clearly not all trials are powered on median OS, as sadly I think we're going to find out, with Merck and head and neck soon. But I think that the fact is, using a tool such as this does afford an opportunity to in fairly short sequence get a picture for how we're faring across different metrics and maybe informing where we go in future trials. In terms of external applications, as perhaps should be obvious, not widely used with HTA agencies. I think we've attempted, there have been explorations of conversations with HTAs presenting RVA data, not with great success. However, there's been most of the use or tremendous success in conversations with local payers, particularly with institutional budget holders, as well as policymakers. And again, it is important to recognize many of you in the PSOP graduate program are, I'm sure, learning quite a bit about cost effectiveness analysis. One thing I didn't learn in school, because when I was in school, it was presented as this is how it's done. If we're going to do economic evaluations, this is it. What they don't tell you, or what you may not know, is that different stakeholders are going to ask for different things. And sure, NICE wants that, and other agencies may follow NICE, but particularly when you get down to a local level, they don't want that. They want something that's simpler. They want something that's more transparent. And sorry, please correct me if I step out of line and you want to whip me with a bullwhip or something. Well, we won't go there. That's too Lyle Bootman. But I can
too soon, Jim.
No, I have pictures of him with his arm around me. I went to grad school. Now I'm thinking I'm still dirty. I feel dirty. It's so sad. It's lo how the mighty have fallen. But that being said, it's important to recognize that in some cases that, again, you want to have a broad toolkit. And in some cases, the type of information that's demanded may be something that's a bit simpler.
What do they want?
What you're going to see momentarily, yeah. Which, again, would you like a barf bucket? I can get one for you. I kid you not, we've had quite a bit of success with this thing. Again, I had the same concerns, where's the mixed treatment comparisons? Don't mess with success. Publications, there have been a number of publications on RVA that have been appeared in the literature. As of yet, we don't have a peer-reviewed paper. There is one that is currently under review, however. And I didn't list, we have an ISPOR abstract this year as well. So hopefully if anyone in this room is reviewing it, please be kind. It's ISPOR. Come on, everything gets accepted. So sorry to, sorry to address your questions. Basically, present a simple example that honestly is not too far off from the types of situations that our market colleagues do experience. And again, keep in mind, everyone probably thinks like, oh, they're thinking about NICE in the UK and everything's like well structured and defined and everybody's smart. It's like you think more like Greece, think more like Latin America, think more like they're not top tier markets, but markets that are not totally unimportant. And in many cases, even Canada, Simon's in Rockford. In many cases, again, it's simpler wins the day. So this has happened many times. We've gotten this question, particularly for ipilimumab. Payers have basically challenged the cost of IO therapy given median OS data, basically saying, well, the median OS data says you don't really differentiate, and median OS is median OS, and you're telling me, the drug costs X, and I say the rent is too high. A response that has been put forward, of course, is that, well, yeah, median OS is median OS, but median OS ain't the end of the story, and you're not seeing the full picture. That with ipilimumab, we have some pretty hard data on this. There is a substantial proportion of patients, maybe 20%, who instead of like living 6 months may live 3 years, 5 years. Okay, and that ain't going to show up on a median, but it is going to show up on other metrics such as the mean or milestone survival. So taking looking at cases involving, say, melanoma and non-small cell lung cancer, some simple graphs of outcomes using multiple metrics and bivariate plots looking at outcomes by cost. So within melanoma, here we're looking at data for ipilimumab first and second line versus vemurafenib. And these are median, mean, OS, as well as 1 year milestone survival and number needed to treat. What we can see here, what should be pretty clear, not too much to distinguish via median OS, but quite a bit going on with regard to mean and 1 year survival as well as number needed to treat. Again, highlighting what I said earlier, that there is this differentiation if you use the right metrics that are more sensitive to what's going on in the tail of the survival distribution. Moving on to a couple of cost value graphs. These are simple. Here we're not just looking at melanoma, but actually looking at a market basket of tumor types and lines of treatment. A couple of things to point out. In addition to the scatter plot, we have a regression line, which roughly could be interpreted as sort of an average expected value for cost. Above the line, good. Below the line, bad. Some things to point out as well to set expectations when you're trying to interpret data like this, because obviously these are quite, there's a lot of heterogeneity in these data. Tumor types which already are associated with a high baseline survival. So, for example, prostate. In general, the absolute gains in survival are going to be greater than those which are associated with a low baseline survival, such as lung cancer, non-small cell lung cancer. So, I mean, if you have 20 months of baseline or 20 month survival expectation in baseline, a 50% improvement is going to be a 10-month gain. Versus a 2 month, 50% on a 2 month baseline survival is a 1 month gain. So again, just to help set expectations for what you're seeing in the data. Importantly here, and I understand that the pointer doesn't work. Apparently not. What you can see is that Yervoy is below the line. So again, here based on a median OS metric. Really no differentiation versus the pack, except with regard to being on the far end with regard to cost. Conversely, looking at it from using mean OS, and obviously the story appears to be somewhat different. And again, for those of you familiar with the Yervoy survival data in melanoma, what you're seeing is, I think, a not inaccurate representation, or at least in terms of setting expectations. The survival data for Yervoy were outstanding. It's not a panacea drug for sure, but moving from a 6-month survival to a 5-year survival was a game changer. And to some degree that's represented here, again, illustrating that there's some percentage of patients who are experiencing extreme survival benefit, which clearly was not picked up by median OS. Moving on to lung cancer, here we see a graph of 1-year survival for various agents approved to treat non-small cell lung cancer. Importantly, we see nivolumab both for squamous and non-squamous histologies toward the top end of the graph, as well as erlotinib. And so it's not a perfect story from a BMS standpoint, but there's a reason that this is also occurring. Moving to the cost value graph, where we're looking at the same set of comparators, same data, but now factoring in treatment as well. And again, nivolumab, squamous and non-squamous appear to look fairly well, and again, I can't point it out. But erlotinib, of course, you could argue, well, what about erlotinib? Erlotinib's a lot, cheaper and almost appears better than the squamous and almost as good as the non-squamous. And of course, there's no inferences here, right? No statistics. Again, another caveat to take into account when evaluating these data. Erlotinib, that data point's based on a placebo-controlled trial, whereas the Nivo data are based on active comparators. So again, one thing to consider if you're presenting these data like this to a decision maker, you have to present it all and say effectively, okay, here's all the limitations. This data point was based on a trial with these assumptions. This data point's based on a trial with those assumptions, et cetera. You make the call. You make the decision. Moreover, another thing to consider in terms of how I guess you would say the relative ranking of non-squamous versus squamous. Again, the baseline survival in squamous is lower than non-squamous, so that the relative magnitude gain improvement in 1-year survival between the two is would be consistent in line with expectations. One additional thing that's an interesting point in this graph, bevacizumab. Bevacizumab, that is based on a trial in first line. First line, in general, you would expect outcome gains to be greater than second or later lines. So based on this compilation of data, bevacizumab looks actually rather poor. I would go in to use an adjective there, but we'll just leave it at poor relative to other comparators. Some limitations which should be obvious and should be clearly disclosed to anyone who would ever be witness to these data. Certainly not a replacement for cost effectiveness analysis or budget impact modeling. There are certainly agencies, decision makers for whom those data are fit for purpose. It's certainly there is no attempt to try to correct for all of the inter-trial differences that would be accounted for in an appropriate CEA. We don't take into account, these are based on publicly disclosed prices, and so anything that's not publicly disclosed is not taken into account. Does not adjust for differences in comparators or characteristics in patient populations across studies. So we discussed, or I mentioned, some of the issues around differences in comparators. That's something that can be handled in a discussion, can be helped in terms of facilitated in a conversation with a stakeholder, but there's no active adjustment for that. Crossover in trials can lead to differences in, can confound OS estimates and result in further issues about comparability of OS estimates across studies. Interestingly, a point that may not have been clear to you, so I presented mean OS data. Mean OS, for those of you who may be unfamiliar, is estimated from can be estimated from a Kaplan-Meier curve as area under the curve. But typically, you're stuck with whatever the last data point on that curve was. So you, in general, underestimate the true mean OS. And so in order to get over that, there are more sophisticated estimation procedures that can be employed, but they actually cost a lot of money. It costed a lot of money for me to try to do them, and they take time to do them. The data I presented to you are corrected mean OS, or what would be called restricted mean OS estimates, at least for these indications that I presented. But again, that's something also to consider if you're ever witness to presentations of mean OS data. And lastly, as I said earlier, no statistical inferences. So I mean, roughly qualitatively, one can make assessments as good, bad, better, worse, but there's no statistical inferences to be had. So as I mentioned earlier, there is an evolving landscape in terms of value assessment. A number of other agencies, entities are moving into this game, such as ASCO and ESMO, NCCN, the drug abacus developed by faculty at Memorial Sloan Kettering. All of these tools differ quite substantially from one another. Part of it is the perspective that's being applied in each instance. But I think one thing to step back and think about, because people always want to bash the pharmaceutical industry, and it's easy, frankly, to look at my presentation and say it's biased. He's presenting a bunch of positive data for Nevo and Yervoy. This had to go through public disclosure. If there was a lawyer reviewed this before it went out, if there was significant concerns about bias, I would not have been able to present it. I think, moreover, I personally have reservations when different agencies get into trying to tell policymakers what's value added and what's not value added, and if there's a lack of transparency, I have concerns about is there a reason why they're doing this? Is their own perspective biasing what they're doing? And moreover, ultimately, we need to think about how all of these value frameworks are going to ultimately affect pricing and reimbursement decisions, or could affect some sort of price restriction policy, in a worst case scenario in the U.S., which might initially seem to be very good for payers and patients, but ultimately would be very, I think, bad for patients, as development would unquestionably dry up and move to other therapeutic areas. And I'd be happy to discuss that with anyone after the presentation. So a brief summary of the different frameworks. And again, since this has been publicly disclosed, I'd be happy to at least share sections of the presentation with interested parties. This may be something useful for those of you not familiar with all the frameworks. Most of the frameworks have been developed with a physician audience in mind. Exceptions include the RVA tool, obviously, but also NCCN and ICER's frameworks. Most of them currently focus on advanced treatment for metastatic disease. A couple of them, the ASCO and ESMO tools, do encompass adjuvant treatment as well. In terms of the breadth of the evidence, I mean, there's a great deal of heterogeneity in terms of where the evidence came from, in terms of the depth of the evidence, as well as what efficacy measures are included. Additionally, what else would I point out? In terms of quality of life data, only the ESMO tool currently includes any quality of life data. Evaluation of combination therapies, at least most of them currently include the capacity for including combos. And in terms of costs, most currently have a capacity to encompass cost data, though most do not currently take into account costs borne by patients, which I think is an evolving area of interest as well, and something I mentioned earlier, areas for research. That's actually another one to think about. Some issues or limitations with these frameworks. Subjectivity. I believe very strongly that what you see in terms of the results of each of these things is driven a lot by subjectivity. So, I mean, in RVA, frankly, the initial tumor selection that was included in the RVA tool was driven, frankly, by the indications that we were pursuing at the time. That's changed over time to include a broader selection of tumor types. But something to think about when you're looking at all of these, just because something comes from clinicians affiliated with ASCO doesn't mean it's unbiased. Incomplete evidence. I think I referenced on the previous slide that the evidence base for some of these tools, particularly the ASCO tool, I think could be described as weak. Patient-centered metrics, an important area for research, though not currently represented in most of the tools. Most of the tools do not adequately capture the size of the population affected by a given tumor type, nor unmet need, burden of illness. It is something that we have some functionality built into our VA to account for, but it's not certainly it's not a key part of our VA. Limited opportunity for feedback. So there really isn't, for most of these tools, not a built-in mechanism for users or stakeholders to provide feedback to lead to further revisions or adjustments. Limited customization or customizability. And I think a key one is the selection of value metrics incorporated in the tools. In many cases, they're too few, or even potentially what could be viewed as a skewed selection of value metrics. For instance, the ASCO tool, as Suri and I were discussing earlier today. Four of the frameworks I've discussed or presented actually provide scores. They're scoring metrics. And there are papers, at least around the ASCO tool, for instance, but it's not exactly clear how they came to derive these metrics. So, as I lose my voice again, something worthwhile looking at is to actually read through the paper, for instance, on the ASCO framework, and see, in fact, that the description of their methods is all of probably about 200 words, and it's not clear at all how they actually came up with their scoring framework, which comprises, I think, like 3 or 5 papers in an appendix at the end of the manuscript. And again, ultimately, lack of transparency is a problem. So a case study to show some issues around these scoring frameworks, consider enzalutamide versus placebo in castration-resistant prostate cancer. There's a tumor type you really don't want. If you run the scenario through the ASCO, you get something that comes up with a relatively low benefit score and a high predicted cost. ESMO would actually grade it pretty highly. In the drug abacus from Memorial Sloan Kettering would actually give it an estimated price lower than the actual price. So a fair amount of heterogeneity due to heterogeneity amongst the tools. And again, as I was just discussing with one or two of you earlier today, this is another area that I think there needs to be more scrutiny of, is what are the limitations of these tools, and are there areas for improvement? So a couple other things just to point on. So with the exception of the ICER framework, all of these are focusing solely on oncology. It's oncology, unfortunately, where all of the scrutiny is occurring currently. And I think there is a potential downside of that in terms of if it leads to actions that are not really very judicious, could result in development implications downstream. Additionally, as I mentioned, the mechanism for providing a lack of transparency and particularly with regard to ability to provide feedback on these tools, simply that just is not there currently. So in conclusion, and I think we're pretty close to time, there's a great deal of scrutiny currently being put on oncology therapies, and I think this is only going to grow in the near future and going to bleed over into the Cancer Drug Fund, particularly in the UK. There's a lot of need for further research in this area. I've mentioned a number of areas during this presentation. I think it's important that that work be conducted or driven not only by external agencies, but also by the industry, frankly, to keep things balanced or keep perspective balanced. And ultimately, we need to not lose sight of patient well-being. Ultimately, what's going to be best for patients is having availability of products, frankly, like the IO therapies. I'll use pembrolizumab to be unbiased. Jimmy Carter would be on his deathbed if it were not for pembrolizumab. David Bowie might have, for all we know, his 18 months might have been attributable to one of these agents. Having available these agents is important, and making decisions solely based on price which could have development implications, may not be the wisest thing to do. So I think that's it.
Thanks, Jim, for